Burlingame, Kansas is about as small town America as small towns can get. Most of the 1,000 residents are farmers or small shop owners, living a charmed, quiet life in a place that had once been a sprawling and lively hotspot of activity. Positioned on the Santa Fe Trail, Burlingame had once benefited from the many ox-drawn wagons and commuters passing through its borders during the late 19th century. After that, the town kept itself alive and thriving when the Forbes Air Force Base was built nearby, but nowadays, with both the trail and the base gone, Burlingame has become one of those real small town communities where everyone knows everyone else. But in the summer of 2009, over 300 Burlingame residents made their way towards the local school to fill out a questionnaire. One that marked, hopefully, the beginning of the end of a tragic event that had tried to change the face of their tight-knit and caring community. The Burlingame residents had been called upon to form a jury, one that would come face to face with a man who had killed one of their own. It all started with James Craig Kahler and his wife Karen. Poised, charming, and successful, the Kahlers seemed to live the perfect life. James and Karen had met at Kansas State University, and right from the get-go it looked like the pair of them had been cut from the same cloth. Both James and Karen were the best of the best, the top of their classes, and they were both ambitious. During his final year, James was one of only 3 students who were handpicked for a lucrative and exclusive engineering job in Colorado. Karen was still only in her first year of university when James was offered this new job, and perhaps sensing the opportunities this job would bring for the pair of them, Karen agreed to move out with James to begin a new life in Colorado. Within 2 years, the couple were married, with their first daughter, Emily, on the way. James threw himself into his work, and Karen threw herself into her new role of dutiful wife and caring homemaker. Those who knew them said that Karen seemed to enjoy bending over backwards to make James happy, and the couple seemed to benefit from the decisions and sacrifices the pair of them made up until that point. That was especially true when James was offered another top position, this time as the utility director of Weatherford, Texas. This was another lucrative job offer, one that the Kahlers accepted and led them to being able to buy a mansion in Weatherford. The family settled, grew in number with 2 more children, Lauren and Sean, and they all seemed to thrive. But things in life are rarely as they seem on the surface. While most people in Weatherford were trying to keep up with the Kahlers, the list of things that Karen was having to do to keep James happy kept getting longer and longer. James gave Karen an allowance, but even then he watched it very carefully. Karen had to present receipts for everything she bought, including groceries and essentials for the children, so James could see exactly what she was spending the money on. But that wasn't all. Karen had a curfew, and not just one that meant she had to be home at a certain time. She was supposed to be in bed by 9 o'clock at night, but she usually was anyway. That was because Karen was to make herself available to James every day at precisely 8 p.m. if she wanted her household to continue to run smoothly and to keep James off her back. Wanting to have some escape from the growingly tight conditions at home, Karen joined a gym called Powerhouse. She knew that James would never agree to pay for her membership, and she knew that he would find out if she used her allowance to pay for it herself, so Karen got creative. She made extra money baking and selling cakes, and she paid for her own membership this way. Karen was a big hit at Powerhouse. The people there loved her and her positive attitude, and before long, they actually offered her a position. Karen became a paid fitness instructor, and now that she could make her own money, James supported her new career choice, as long as she was back in time to look after the children, of course. Karen loved working at the gym, and she loved having a place where she could just be herself. But some people say that there was another reason, aside from money, that James had a sudden change of heart and let Karen keep her new job. Whilst working at Powerhouse, Karen met a woman called Sunny Reese. Karen and Sunny had become best friends, which of course meant that James had met Sunny too. James thought that Karen hanging out with Sunny was a great idea, and some accounts say that he even encouraged Karen to take things further. According to these accounts, James propositioned Karen and Sunny to have a threesome, a proposition that the two women quickly refused. To try to sweeten the deal and win her over, James started sending flowers to Sunny and text messages, hoping that she would come around and agree to include him in the burgeoning relationship between the two women. But Sunny was having none of it. Once James realised that the relationship between Karen and Sunny was only getting more serious and he was actually losing control of his own relationship with Karen, James pulled the plug on the entire thing. In the summer of 2008, despite no one else in his family wanting to go with him, James got a job in Columbia, Missouri, and moved his family out there with him. By then, the girls were teenagers and had just begun to spread their wings, and Karen was just beginning to break away from James's constricting rules, and neither of them were willing to go back to the way things had been before. The girls threw themselves back into the local community, and Karen started to rebel even more. She was upset that James had dragged her away from the life she was just starting to live, and she wanted to make sure that he knew it. Instead of calling things off with Sunny, Karen continued to keep in contact with her, and Sunny even managed to come out and spend time with Karen in person. And of course, James didn't like that at all. James and Karen started fighting almost constantly, and things all came to a head on New Year's Eve of 2008. A friend was hosting a party, one that both the Kahlers and Sunny were invited to, and an affair that James had been desperately trying to keep under control suddenly went public. Karen and Sunny kissed at the party. Word spread quickly, and James was fuming. Feeling embarrassed and humiliated, he publicly confronted his wife, resulting in a fight that the whole party witnessed. Now that the cat was out of the bag, the Kahlers were broken, and Karen was done trying to make James happy. She filed for divorce shortly after the party, and she moved into a separate room in the house whilst she awaited for the paperwork to be finalised. Desperate for things to go back to the way they had been before, James started calling members of Karen's family and asked them to convince her to come back to him, pointing out that Karen was making a huge mistake because she was leaving him to be with a woman. Karen didn't budge, and by March of that year, things were worse than ever. Acrimonious divorce proceedings had James convinced that Karen was now after his money, and he wasn't about to let her have it. Something went down in their house in Columbia. James said that he'd only been after a hug and that Karen hadn't wanted to give him one. He'd ended up bruising her arm when she tried to pull away, and the police were called. James was arrested on suspicion of third-degree domestic abuse, and Karen seized her opportunity to be free of James for good. Whilst James was down at the station, Karen packed her belongings and moved herself and the children out to a new house. James had already been acting more and more erratically, but when Karen left with the children, he seemed to snap. He only ever wanted to see her son, Sean, and felt betrayed that his daughters had let Sonny into their family. He blamed the women in his life for what had happened between himself and Karen, and he knew that everything would go back to normal if he could just get Karen back. He spent more and more time following and stalking his wife. He installed spyware on their computer and kept tabs on her during the day and night. He let the air out of her tires so she would know that he was watching her, and he took his problems into work with him too. James spent his hours in the office combing over photo albums of his family. His colleagues described him as obsessed, and there was only so long that his superiors could turn a blind eye to his unusual behaviour. After months of hoping that James would eventually pull through, they fired him, and James lost his last tether to reality. By Thanksgiving weekend of 2009, James was out of a job. He'd lost his family and was still in the middle of divorce proceedings that had started all of this. Everything came back to Karen, and James was starting to realise that she had no intentions of ever coming back to him. Over that weekend, James made it clear that he only wanted to see Sean, so Karen and the girls went over to Karen's sister for the first part of Thanksgiving. The following day, Karen stopped by James's house to pick up Sean so the whole family could go and visit her grandmother, Dorothy White, in her home in Burlingame. That evening, when his family were still in Dorothy's house, James came bursting through the door with a gun in his hand. He first shot Karen and then her 89-year-old grandmother as they sat in the living room. And then he turned on his children. 18-year-old Emily and 16-year-old Lauren tried to get away, but James hunted them through the house and shot them down. Sean managed to get away, and after witnessing his father kill his entire family, he made a desperate run for the neighbours. Sean managed to make it there, and officers were quickly sent to the house. Dorothy and Lauren were still alive when first responders entered the gruesome scene. Dorothy was sent to hospital, where she died 4 days later, but Lauren never made it out of the house. She was found in an upstairs bedroom, bleeding out on the floor. She just about managed to tell the officers that it was her father who had done this to her and her family, and then she slipped away. James was later found aimlessly walking on the side of the road, muttering the words, I messed up, to himself. After the community of Burlingame filed into the school to fill out the paperwork for jury duty, James had his day in court. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity for the murders of Karen, Emily, Lauren, and Dorothy. But Dorothy was part of Burlingame, and the people of Burlingame look after their own. The jury found him guilty of all charges, and James was sentenced to death. He currently sits on death row and continues to appeal his verdict, but the prosecution has stuck with their argument that James was in his right mind when he decided to kill his family. They argued that James had had his hunting rifle with him that day. He had extra rounds of ammunition in his car, and he had enough of his wits about him to spare his son Sean. Whilst being led out of the courtroom, James turned to his parents, asking them to make sure that Sean wasn't raised by those, quote, weirdos, referring to his in-laws who've become Sean's guardians since the terrible events of that Thanksgiving evening.